My name's Kevin Nunn, and I'm part of the Holocaust Memorial Day group. We've been organising Holocaust Memorial Day in Colchester. This is now the 5th year, and of course we're online this year rather than doing it in person, which is a terrible shame. And I came to Holocaust Memorial Day as a focus for campaigning around issues around tolerance between peoples and communities in the wake of the Brexit referendum. And I'm going to be interviewing Rachel, who's helped organise Holocaust Memorial Day, and Emma, and they can introduce themselves.
My name is Rachel Howes-Binnington, and I'm one of the co-organisers for Holocaust Memorial Day, and am a member of the board of the Colchester District Jewish Community, and we're going to be talking about my experiences with Judaism and food and trying to link that with the Holocaust and wider senses of community and food.
I'm Emma Chesters, and I'm a baker, vegan baker, and I'm here to talk about food, the importance of food within communities, within people who've left their homes.
My earliest memory of exposure to Jewish food would probably be being 3 years old, and we were living on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We had these lovely neighbors who lived up the road called the Dorfmans, and they were Jewish. And my mother was at a point, I think, where she was actively pursuing the possibilities of converting to Judaism. It was not something that I ever remember her discussing with my dad. My dad had grown up First Baptist, and his relationship to faith was the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army was his God. And that was all he needed. But my mom needed more. She became friends with the Dorfmans, and they invited us over for Hanukkah. And it was the first time that I had latkes, which to a kid like me, I thought they were just hash browns, right? Like, I didn't know any different. So I just assumed that all hash browns were latkes, and latkes were hash browns. And I remember there was apple cake. There was Apfelkuchen. There was a brisket. There definitely would have been smoked salmon or lox. And there wouldn't have been cream cheese because they were having the brisket. So you wouldn't have had milk and meat together. And this is the early 80s, right? So this is long before soy products are all the rage, and people are very, if you're a vegetarian and you're in the deep South, you're screwed.
When I was 19, I was living in Lanzarote, and I met two girls in the toilet of a nightclub, and we hit it off immediately. And they were both friends from home. And when I came back, because I was living in Lanzarote, when I came back in London, I started spending time with them and their families, and both of them were Jewish. And I remember things like chicken soup, and of having heard about Jewish chicken soup. And I remember Nikki's grandma saying to me, this is really good for you. You'll feel really well after you've eaten it, thinking it's just soup, but just the flavours and everything. And I think I wasn't particularly into cooking then. I was young. I had a job as a magazine writer. I was running around. What I was doing was eating my way around London, every different cuisine that there was to be had. But for comfort, it would be with either Nikki or Alex's family, having food with them. And when I asked Alex about this, what really Jewish food have I had with you? She said, I don't think my family really do Jewish food. And I said, but when anything happens, if somebody's sad, you bring a marble cake. Like, when we had children, if something had happened, either good or bad, Alex would bring a marble cake. I said, so to me, that's Jewish food because you're Jewish and that's your tradition. And she said, well, yeah, it's my mum's tradition too. So, and I said, and you taught me how to properly make chicken soup, obviously before I was vegetarian or vegan. And I have to say that's the one thing that I miss massively. I said, you taught me to make chicken soup. And she said, yeah, but I don't think I made it properly. She said, I think other Jewish people would say I'd missed this out or that out. And both Nikki and Alex, of all my friends, were the ones who food was important to in a way of bringing you in, comforting you. And I don't know if that's a Jewish thing. Oh, it's just coincidence that my two Jewish friends happened to do that and happened to feed me. And that's maybe why they became my best friends.
If I'm really feeling homesick for something that I need, and I need to feel connected, there's nothing like making my way to Brick Lane and getting a bagel with salt beef to just kind of ground me, which is very strange because I'm not from here. So why would that be what grounds me? But it is, Jewish food is the first place I go when I'm feeling bereft. Just, there is nothing. Last night I was really missing my mom, and so I made out with a chicken. I ate the whole damn thing. It would have been embarrassing for other people to see.
And then my friend Adam, who I met through Nikki, who became my flatmate for a long time, he is the person who taught me more about the stories to do with food, like Hamantaschen, and he was telling me it's somebody's ears or somebody's hat for Purim. Yeah. So through him, I learned a lot of the stories. And then through Alex's children, as she grew up, her children went, Nikki's children not so much, but Alex's children went to Jewish school. So my children went to a Catholic school, and I never forgot the upset when we went to stay. It was Lent for us and Purim for Alex and her family. So my children had given up sweets for Lent. Alex's children were dressed up in costume and giving out sweets. And my kids having to sit there and go, we can't have any. And they're like, this is rubbish. This is rubbish, this Lent business.
Mom, wouldn't it be rude not to eat the candy?
Yeah. And from their families as well. You know, I remember going there when I didn't know them that well, but you would be welcomed in and given food. And that was really important, really, really important.
Increasingly, we're defining ourselves by food, it seems to me anyway. So, you know, we've got the public profile of vegans, veganism, veganuary, etc. There's a whole movement that wasn't, you know, that's come in the last few years about the authenticity of foods, you know, that seeking authenticity. Local food has become important, you know, local farmers markets and stuff like that, which, you know, always existed, but we've started to define them as local, and that's become important, you know, and heritage varieties have started reappearing, haven't they? You know, you could never buy 10 years ago. So we're starting to define ourselves a lot more by the food that we eat, I think. And you know, British food culture has always changed and adapted things from around the world. We were talking about that before we started recording. And all nations and peoples sort of try to define themselves by their food. But it seems to me Britain has not been very successful at that. There are regional, local dishes that people prize and cherish. But in terms of British culture, that doesn't really exist around food, I think, and I'm sure anyone watching this will disagree, but it feels like that to me. And I think it's quite interesting to see fish and chips. The one thing that the British might say defines us, you know, as a people, is fish and chips. And of course, that was a Sephardic Jewish recipe that was brought into Britain. I think Jewish people very much define themselves by their food.
We have an entire holiday around it. Around, you know, Passover and matzah, because it was the one thing that you could take with you, and you had to make sure that it was done fast, because you had to get out, because it was about to get very real in a very unpleasant way for you if you hung around. I mean, I think given that we have traditionally become a people who move and travel and have to set ourselves up quickly, we bring the things with us that give us comfort, and our recipes and our ability to set up community fast through our food are how we do that. What is interesting to me is the internal debates within Jewish culture themselves, so like with Ashkenazi and Sephardi, about what makes something Jewish. Is it Jewish in the right way, or the wrong way. And I think more and more it's becoming, for a culture, or for, I don't want to say acculturated Jews, for Jews who define themselves culturally as Jewish but aren't necessarily religiously Jewish, I think it's less of an issue, although I don't think we ever get away from it completely. But I know people who would identify as being culturally Jewish who follow Passover ritual to the nth degree, complete with separate, special Passover cutlery and dishes and pots and pans in a way that I don't. I mean, I don't give away my flour during Passover. I wrap it up in a blanket and I put it in the cupboard. And then, 2 weeks later, I take it out and I put it back on the shelves. I don't get rid of everything in my larder to get ready for Passover. I just ignore certain things most years. There have been years where I haven't done that and where I've felt very distant from my faith. Like the year my mom died, ironically, I turned to chicken soup, but I didn't turn, initially, I didn't turn to my faith. That came later in the year. But I was also pregnant, so that could be why. I don't know.
Emma, you've done lots of work with food with refugee communities in Colchester, and it seems to me there's a continuation to Rachel's point there around travelling and fleeing and moving quickly. Can you tell us some stories about the way that food is important to those communities and your involvement with them and how you've used food with them?
Yeah, I mean, I've just helped a little with the food hygiene classes.
These refugees coming to Colchester.
Refugees coming to Colchester.
Food hygiene. Yeah.
Food hygiene, yeah. And so we would do the food hygiene classes to enable people to get work, maybe, if that's what they wanted to do after. But the classes, I mean, it's very dull, the food hygiene classes, but we would just drift off because there was pictures of food in the book. We'd start saying, oh, I like that, or I don't like that. I make this with this. So food, it just started talking about it, and people got emotional. Things like pistachios. I really remember pistachios coming up, and a client because most of the clients then were Syrian for Refugee Action, saying how in Damascus the pistachio trees grow, and that the pistachios here that they were buying here were so expensive and not good, not like the ones in Damascus. And somebody said about when they lay in bed at night at a certain time of the year, they could hear the pistachios ripening, and it was like a pop, pop, pop sound. And everybody got choked up because those things, you realise, the things that you take for granted so much. My children always talk about a cherry blossom tree they walked past on the way to school when they were younger and how it cheered them up. Those things you take so much for granted, and food is so much of that. And one lady saying about how the food that she wanted to make here was the food that her mother had made, because it brought her back to her mother. She could see her mother cooking, and that she was trying to recreate it, and mostly she was, but there were things she couldn't get, which is why Refugee Action now have their food bank for people to bring in ingredients that are useful to refugee clients, be they from Middle East or Africa, because that came across time and time again in the food hygiene classes, that food was what people were holding on to carry on. And also, I remember somebody saying, oh, I've been sharing the food with my neighbour. Their neighbour was an English person. I've been inviting them in, and they really like it. And the sense of pride and joy of having somebody else appreciate the food that you love and that means so much to you was really important.
And it helps that process of making the transition from assimilation to acculturation in a way that nothing else can. Food.
Yeah.
When you can literally bring something to share to a table.
Yeah.
It makes me as an immigrant feel less other.
Yeah.
other. And I think it makes the people sitting at the table also see me as less other, but in a way they can understand, because I am literally giving them something that I've brought with me.
I was amazed that every Syrian person I met could cook, male, female, they all could cook. And every time I asked everybody, how can you all cook? Because you learn by your mother. It's a really great skill. And if you're in a new country where it's difficult because of language, selling your food is a great way, A, to start a new business, but to integrate you in the community. When Refugee Action did the pop-ups at First Sight.
Oh yeah, those were amazing.
The queue the first day was so long, and that was lovely. That was people showing their solidarity to the refugees. But what was amazing was the second day, so it was on Saturday and Sunday, I think. And Sunday, all the same people came back again. That was because they'd eaten the food then and loved it. So,
And it was
the second day was more of that food, which boosted people so much. I think a lot of people feel, I certainly feel, it's a real privilege to be going to somebody's house for Friday night supper. Go, you know, if my neighbour is Kurdish, and when her son graduated, she did a big meal. It's such a privilege. There is a quote, Anthony Bourdain, the food writer, who hated vegan, but I love it. He said, when someone cooks for you, they are saying something. They are telling you about themselves, who they are, where they came from, what makes them happy. And I think that it's very simple, but I think it's really true.
There was a phenomenon for Jewish communities in the concentration camps during the Holocaust, where they would tell each other recipes. So they would lie in bed at night and make up dishes for great feasts. So they'd imagine a massive feast, and each person would talk about the dish that they would eat at the feast and the recipe that was used to make it and how it was made, etc. That was recorded at a number of camps. So it was a cultural phenomenon, if you like, and all of that in the midst of terrible starvation. And I think that tells us a bit about food and recipes and the real importance of that.
It's important to remember too that when many of the camps were liberated, we have to use that term very loosely, because a lot of those occupants who were liberated ended up staying in those same camps because there was nowhere for them to go. So they went from, being interned at Auschwitz to being like a guest.
Growing up, you'd see war films and people being bombed, and that should be, old war films of Britain in the Blitz or whatever, and that would be shocking. But more so that and seeing people not having food was far more visceral, disturbing. I don't know. It just like you say, it's a human right. And one other thing I remember about my grandparents saying about the war. When they were in Wales, they were quite lucky. Yes, they were rationed, but they were very rural Wales. They had the vegetables that they grew, whatever. I don't think that they really struggled, but they had evacuees coming to stay. And my grandma getting very cross with one of them. She was telling me because he kept stealing food all the time. And she was, why are you stealing? If you just ask, I'll give it to you, stop stealing it. But because I think when he'd left London, that is what he'd been doing, because they hadn't had any food. My grandma was a baker in North Wales. She set up her own bakery when she was 23 in Abersoch in North Wales. And I have her bara brith, which is speckled bread. It's a tea-soaked speckled bread. And it doesn't look very exciting. But I've veganised it, which I'm sure she'll be cross with, but and I've taken it to markets and people love it. I think it's probably one of the most popular things that I make, and every time somebody orders it from me, I feel such the pride that my grandma would feel that people in Essex were eating her, because it would be her bara brith, because although it's been going, she'd made the recipe to herself. She'd made it the way she liked it. She would be absolutely thrilled to know that people were still eating her prized Beribri. So I think that, and she will have got that from her mother, and she will have changed it. And her mother will have got it from her mother, and they will have all changed it along the line, but it's theirs. And I will make my children make Beribri to keep it going, you know.
When I got married, my grandmother, my aunt, and my mom went through and compiled a little cookbook for me of, and got members of my dad's family to write in and contribute. So I have like my dad's favorite recipe for his favorite ambrosia salad, which is, you know, not everybody likes ambrosia. I like it. It's basically fruit cocktail with cream and coconut, and it's amazing. It's not amazing. It's terrible, but I love it. But one of the recipes that's in there is my great grandmother Marjorie, whose family were the family that left Prussia and converted to Moravianism and settled in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. But the recipe that has come down through their family is of a marble cake.
Oh,
yeah. And so I'm thinking about that. I'm like, here I am saying, you know, Marjorie never acknowledged that there was any Jewishness in her family. But I'm like, but wait a minute. We've got this recipe for marble cake.
I love cooking with rose and cardamom. They're my favourite things. And I was growing roses in the garden and drying them, rose petals. And then I walked into the newish Middle Eastern shop, off Queen Street. And I saw that they had rose petals. And I thought, that's great, because I'd gone to get rose water, but I needed rose petals because I haven't got any left in the garden. And I was just standing in the shop and I looked at the packet at where the roses had come from. And it said from Syria. And I stopped in my tracks and thought, it's hard. I can't really explain why it was so impactful, but I think it was because remembering those conversations when doing the food hygiene classes with people from Syria, and them talking about how much they missed their gardens, they missed their homes, obviously their families, but it's just the small things, the gardens, the things that they were growing, the vegetables. We talked about vegetables we could grow. Roses definitely came up. And just looking at this packet of roses, that I'm sure those people are still missing their gardens, and yet these roses have managed to get out and come here. And, you know, it just seemed, when will the Syrians get to go home and see their gardens? So I thought, right, these roses have to go to a good use. So I make these little shortbread cookies called nankatai, which is Indian, but it's rose and cardamom shortbread. So I thought, right, I'm going to put these roses in nankatai, and then all the money that the nankatai makes can go back to Refugee Action. And then the roses are helping Refugee Action. So it just seemed kind of right. As soon as I'd seen where they come from, this is the right place for these rose petals to go. But that is the power of food, and I don't know. Food can do so much in connecting people. It really does. I really, really believe that it's one of the main ways that we connect, because we all eat. We all look at food so differently, but we all love food. Maybe not everybody, but most people do. And when you say in the Holocaust, people thinking of food, of course you would, because you're not just thinking of food, even if it's the most delicious chocolate cake. You're not thinking of the fact that it's just food, but it would remind you of your mother's house, or the people that you ate the chocolate cake with, who made the chocolate cake. It's all those connections. It's not just the taste, is it?
There's a bakery here in Colchester that does challah. It's not kosher challah, so there was a whole discussion on one of my apps about whether or not I should even be feeding it to my children for this holiday. Anyway, I walked in and the woman says to me, oh, I know what it was for. It wasn't during the last lockdown, it was for Rosh Hashanah. And she says, it's the Jewish New Year tonight, isn't it? And I said, yes, it is. And she said, so are you Jewish? And I said, yes, I am. She says, oh, I'm so excited. I can't remember the last time I met a Jewish person in Colchester. And I said, well, we're here. I think She's like, but it's so nice that you've come here for your challah. And I said, well, I was just excited to find that you were doing it. And I said, I will definitely be back. But it was just that interesting moment where they've chosen to do something that isn't part of their tradition. They're not Jewish. Why would you make challah other than the fact that it's delicious?
It's lovely.
It's the best. And they were ecstatic that their tribute to what they saw as my culture was being recognized by me as being worthy of consuming. And this felt like a moment of unity. And it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the bread. My first encounter of your food, Emma, was through book club. And at every book and bakes, you'd send a card with where the recipe came from and what it meant to you with whatever Joe was serving up.
For the book, she asked me to match it with the book, didn't she?
Yeah, but you always talked about the origins, and I thought that is what it should be about.
I do love baking, obviously, and I love eating it, but it is reading cookbooks. I said before, didn't I, when I used to go and stay with my friends Alex and Nikki separately, I would get down their Claudia Roden Book of Jewish Cooking and rudely ignore them for an hour. I mean, at first it was just to get the recipes, but then because I remember being transfixed about her childhood in Egypt before they had to leave, and it was fascinating. And it's told so much about her family, the people who lived there, and then it went on to Syria and everywhere. I was absolutely fascinated. So I would just sit, and then I'd go to Nikki's house and do a bit more. And they both said in the end, you can go and buy that book. You don't have to be a Jewish woman to have that book. You can walk into any bookshop and you can buy that book. So,
in fact, we've gone and bought you this book. Happy Hanukkah.
Go away and leave our books alone. Or come and talk to us. Stop just looking at the book. But what fascinated me was that every recipe had a story behind it. Not necessarily a religious story, but the story of the people who ate it and why they ate it. And a similar book, I think, is Jerusalem by Ottolenghi and his. So Ottolenghi is Israeli Jewish, isn't he? And his business partner is Palestinian. So they talk about the food of Jerusalem, both their childhoods growing up in it. And I just find it the most fascinating book. Because, yes, their recipes cross over, and they do a really funny introduction on the hummus one, on who made the hummus. But it is beautiful. It really, really is so much more than just a cookery book. You learn so much from it. And that is what fascinates me. And maybe that is the power of food, that if you just look, if you read cookery books like that, you'll find out much more. You wouldn't find that out about the clothes that people wear, would you? You'd find things out. But food is just so... And you do feel like you've travelled. You do feel like you've met the people. You do feel, just from a cookery book, if it's written well, if it's really written well.
Food has always been a commodity, and that from the time of any kind of diaspora, there's a secondary market in food and trade. I mean, you look at the spice route. Because I think you can take it with you and you can trade it. It is something that you need. You can't eat money. You can eat a bagel. You can eat fish and chips. You can make it on the fly and you can give it to people and you can sneak it. You know, if it's something that travels well, you can sneak it. I mean, I remember working on a project in Louisiana and going through these French colonial records, and off of Dauphin Island, which is a tiny little island off of the coast of Alabama, they've caught rum and silk stocking smugglers. This is 1558. Rum and silk stockings and salted cod were the three things that were being smuggled. And you think, so it really is just what you can grab and take with you and what, people are going to need. I find it interesting that silk stockings were on the list, but then again, this is before long trousers. So men would be wearing stockings as well as women. and you'd want them to be silk, I guess, because we hadn't created nylon or polyester yet. I haven't discovered that you really have this tradition over here, and we have, but it's a very, very Midwestern, very Southern thing as well. To do potlucks.
Yes.
The best potlucks are the ones where people will share their recipes.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes they won't because it's a family secret.
Yeah.
You know, my mom had this dip that she would never, and it's like the stereotypical Midwestern dip, and it's not that it is not a Jewish dip by any stretch of the imagination, because it's dried beef and cream cheese, and I think it's terrible, but it's so good. Dried beef, cream cheese, is there sour cream or is it mayonnaise? Anyway, and dill. And she'd never share the recipe because she didn't want anyone else to serve it when we were being stationed to different places. And she wouldn't give me the recipe, and I'm her daughter. Like, I was not allowed to have the recipe until I was 33. It was 2011 before she gave me the recipe.